Although President Clinton had been a moderate Democrat, supporting some conservative approaches, the Republicans, who had a majority in the House of Representatives, they moved to have Clinton impeached when it came out that he had lied about having an extramarital affair with a White House intern named Monica Lewinsky. And so President Clinton was impeached, but not removed from office by the Senate. Now, in the election of 2000, Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, ran against the son of former President George H.W. Bush. Okay, and his son's name was George W. Bush. In a controversial victory, because Al Gore actually won the popular vote, George W. Bush won the Electoral College based on a very close race in Florida. Okay, the counting of the ballots in Florida came under question, though, and Gore demanded a recount. But the Supreme Court, in the case of Bush versus Gore, ruled to stop the recount because the 14th Amendment required that all votes be counted in the same manner, even though in modern elections there were several different machines that were used, including handwritten ballots. Ultimately, the governor of Florida, who was George W. Bush's brother, confirmed that Bush had won the state, thus giving him the presidency. On September 11, 2001, terrorists hijacked 4 commercial airplanes. 2 of the planes were flown into the World Trade Center in New York. The 2 towers of the World Trade Center eventually collapsed, causing the death of thousands. And another plane, the third plane, was flown into the Pentagon. And the 4th plane landed in a field near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, after passengers had struggled to gain control of the plane from the terrorists. Now, President Bush, still in his first year as president, announced a war on terror, and he blamed a terrorist organization known as Al-Qaeda for 9/11, right? The attacks on 9/11. And Al-Qaeda was led by a man named Osama bin Laden, okay? You remember bin Laden? Bin Laden had received financial support from the CIA, okay? He got money from the CIA during the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, okay? So he was an ally, right? Bin Laden used to be an ally of the US. So Osama bin Laden, who was a strict Orthodox Muslim, he opposed the United States and Western cultural influence in general in the Middle East, right? He didn't like the idea that the West and the US had cultural influence in the Middle East. He also opposed the US military presence in Saudi Arabia, which was his home country. Now that he was firmly entrenched with bases in the mountains of Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda led several terrorist attacks against the United States, including attacks on US embassies in Tanzania and in Kenya, okay? So 2 US embassies in Africa, okay? And so Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda eventually would claim responsibility for the attacks on 9/11. Now, after the attacks on 9/11, President Bush declared a war on terrorism, right? And so the first instance of the war on terror occurred in Afghanistan after the Taliban government refused to deliver Osama bin Laden to the United States. US forces eventually removed the Taliban from power, and a new democratic government was established there in Afghanistan. But the war in Afghanistan would go on and on for decades. Members of the Bush administration, such as the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and the Vice President, Dick Cheney, then began to push for a war to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, okay? President Bush began to publicly accuse Saddam Hussein of stockpiling weapons of mass destruction. And he also claimed that Hussein was working on creating nuclear weapons. Despite not having approval from the United Nations, which, remember, was created to stop such wars, the United States, along with its ally Great Britain and several other allies, invaded Iraq in 2003, and they forcibly removed Saddam Hussein from power. He was later captured and put on trial and was executed. But instead of being seen as liberators, a large Iraqi insurgency developed which fought against US forces. It was later proven that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and Saddam Hussein had no connection whatsoever to the attacks on 9/11. But one thing that Iraq did have was massive oil fields. And these oil fields had been nationalized, which means that they were under the control of the Iraqi government, meaning no private or foreign oil companies could access them. Okay, no private or foreign oil companies could access those oil fields. But after the Iraq War, though, US and British oil companies moved in and gained control of many of Iraq's oil fields. For example, Halliburton, Halliburton, an oil industry related corporation, benefited greatly from the Iraq War, and Vice President Dick Cheney was the former CEO of Halliburton before running for office. And he was given tens of millions of dollars when he left that company. And so these types of connections have caused many to claim that the Iraq War was primarily about oil, not about terrorism. Remember, Dick Cheney, the vice president, he was pushing for the Iraq War, and he has this connection to Halliburton, right? And then you see all of these foreign companies from the US and Britain getting involved in Iraq's oil fields. Another component of the war on terror was to find domestic terrorists in the United States. In 2001, Congress passed the Patriot Act, which allowed government agencies to spy on Americans, including putting taps on their phones, reading their mail, reading their emails, and getting records from colleges and libraries of people who they suspected of terrorism. But many people who were spied on didn't have any ties to terrorism. Also, President Bush issued an executive order to allow the National Security Agency, the NSA, to tap phone calls without a warrant, which was against the law because the NSA wasn't supposed to launch investigations on US soil. But President Bush is giving an executive order to allow this to happen. Also, as part of the war on terror, the United States established prisons for suspected terrorists, such as in Cuba at Guantanamo Bay, as well as several secret prisons in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe, where the CIA interrogated and held suspected terrorists, often without any charge. US officials would also use torture while interrogating prisoners, such as waterboarding, which gives the prisoner the effect of drowning. Prisoners were also physically assaulted, beaten up, they had dogs sick on them, and were humiliated while being detained. Eventually, it had become publicly known that the US had authorized torture at these secret prison sites. In addition, President Bush also decreed an executive order for the creation of secret military tribunals or military trials for suspected foreign terrorists. That basically meant that foreign detainees would not receive constitutional protections in a court of law. They didn't have the right to a lawyer, for example, but The Supreme Court found that President Bush's executive order had broke the rules of the Geneva Convention and was thus found to be unlawful. Overall, the actions by the Bush administration in the war on terror uh, ranged from questionable motives of the Iraq War to spying on the American people, to the mistreatment of suspected terrorists, both foreign and domestic. All of this hurt the reputation of the United States as a champion of freedom and democracy.